It was the decade when everything seemed possible, until it wasn't. They called it the Roaring Twenties. And for good reason. The First World War was a distant memory. American factories roared back to life, jazz clubs spilled music onto the streets, and on Wall Street the future seemed paved with gold. A new kind of optimism swept the nation. People believed they had cracked the code for endless prosperity. And why wouldn't they? The stock market was on an unstoppable climb. Stock prices didn't just rise, they soared. First doubling, then tripling. The lure of easy money was irresistible. It wasn't just the bankers and the industrialists playing the market anymore. It was everyone. Teachers, factory workers, farmers. Ordinary people were pouring their life savings into stocks. Newspapers celebrated this new era of wealth for all. It felt like a national party, and everyone was invited. But beneath the glittering surface, a dangerous game was being played. The foundation of this new prosperity was built on shaky ground: debt. Banks were lending money with reckless abandon. All you needed was a dream and a desire to invest. The most popular way to buy stocks was on margin. Imagine buying a $100 stock by putting down only $10 and borrowing the other $90 from your broker. It seemed like a genius move when prices were skyrocketing. By 1929, Americans had borrowed over $10 billion this way. It was a mountain of debt, invisible to most, but growing larger every day. At the same time, the real economy was showing signs of strain. The roaring factories were producing more cars, radios, and appliances than people could actually afford to buy. Out on the farms, harvests were so large that crop prices started to fall. A critical imbalance was forming. While corporate profits and stock prices went through the roof, wages for the average worker barely budged. The gap between the rich and everyone else widened. The glittering tower of the 1920s economy was hollow on the inside, just waiting for a strong wind to knock it all down. That wind came on a Thursday, October 24, 1929. History would remember it as Black Thursday. Without any warning, the market started to fall. Not just a dip, but a steep, terrifying drop. The ticker tapes couldn't keep up with the pace of selling. Panic set in. A group of Wall Street's most powerful bankers tried to stop the bleeding. They pooled their money and started buying huge blocks of stock to prop up prices. For a moment, it seemed to work. The market stabilized. A collective sigh of relief echoed through the financial district. The weekend passed in a tense quiet. Many hoped the worst was over. They were wrong. When the market opened the following week, the calm shattered. Monday, October 28th, brought a new wave of selling. Then came Tuesday, October 29th, Black Tuesday, the day the dam broke. It was pure chaos. 16 million shares were traded in a single day, a record that would stand for decades. Fortunes built over a decade were wiped out in a matter of hours. The floor of the New York Stock Exchange became a scene of desperation. People shouted, wept, and watched their dreams turn to dust on the flickering tickers. In just a few days, $40 billion of wealth vanished into thin air. That's more than the entire US government spent during World War I. The Roaring Twenties were over. The party had ended, and the hangover was about to begin. The stock market crash wasn't the end of the story. It was the trigger. Think of it as the spark that lit the fuse on a much larger bomb. The banks that had so eagerly lent money for margin buying were now in deep trouble. Their customers were broke and couldn't pay back their loans. As the loans went bad, the banks started to fail. And in the 1930s, when a bank failed, it was a catastrophe. There was no FDIC, no federal insurance to protect your savings. If your bank went under, your money was just gone. This fear triggered bank runs across the country. People rushed to withdraw their cash, but for many it was too late. They arrived to find the doors locked and a note taped to the window. Between 1930 and 1933, Over 9,000 banks in the United States collapsed, taking the savings of millions of families with them. The financial system, the very heart of the economy, was seizing up. The damage rippled outwards. With no money and no credit, people stopped buying things. With no one buying, factories shut down. Businesses closed their doors. The unemployment rate, which had been a low 3% in 1929, began to skyrocket. By 1933, 1 in every 4 American workers was unemployed. 25%. That's a staggering number. In the cities, long lines formed outside soup kitchens. People who once had steady jobs now stood for hours hoping for a piece of bread. The crisis hit farmers just as hard. With people in the cities too poor to buy food, the prices for crops and livestock plummeted. Farmers were producing more food than ever, but they couldn't sell it. Desperate, some resorted to burning their crops for fuel, or dumping milk into rivers, while millions across the nation went hungry. The irony was cruel and absolute. Amid this growing despair, the nation's leaders seemed paralyzed. President Herbert Hoover, a man who believed deeply in American self-reliance, urged calm. He repeatedly told the public that the economy was fundamentally sound and that prosperity was just around the corner. But with each passing month, that corner seemed to get further and further away. The government's response was minimal, based on the belief that the economy would correct itself. But this was not a normal downturn. The crisis was no longer just about stocks and banks. It had become a profound human tragedy. Families were evicted from their homes, forced to live in shanty towns they ironically named Hoovervilles. The American dream had turned into a nightmare. This wasn't just a financial collapse. It was a crisis of faith. A crisis in capitalism, in government, and in the future itself. The roar of the 20s had faded into a whisper of despair, and that whisper was turning into a cry for help, a cry that would soon echo around the world, setting the stage for an even greater global conflict. The world hadn't just stumbled, it had set itself on fire. The market had crashed, but the human cost was only beginning. By 1931, the Great Depression had morphed from a financial headline into the worst economic disaster in modern history. The Roaring Twenties fell silent, replaced by a deafening quiet. Factories that once pulsed with life stood still, their chimneys cold against the sky. In Detroit, the heart of American industry, car plants that had built the very symbols of success were now just ghostly shells. Men who once proudly assembled those machines now wandered the streets, their dignity stripped away, holding signs that read, "Willing to work for food." The numbers were staggering. In New York, over 1 million people were jobless. In Chicago, 20,000 children went to bed hungry every night. Survival became a desperate daily calculus. Families sold anything of value, furniture, jewelry, even their wedding rings, just to put a meal on the table. And then, as if the economic collapse wasn't enough, nature unleashed its own cruel punishment. They called it the Dust Bowl. For years, farmers across the Great Plains, driven by the promise of endless bounty, had plowed the soil without mercy. They tore up the deep-rooted prairie grasses that had held the earth together for centuries. When a severe drought hit in 1930, the exposed land turned to powder. The winds came next. They swept across Oklahoma, Kansas, and Texas, lifting the precious topsoil into enormous rolling black clouds. It was as if the earth itself was dying. Farmers called them black blizzards. These monstrous dust storms could roll for miles, blotting out the sun at midday, turning day into an apocalyptic night. People tried to fight it. They stuffed wet rags in the cracks of their windows and doors. They covered their faces with damp cloths. But the dust was relentless. It seeped into everything. It filled lungs, causing a new illness called dust pneumonia. It coated beds and food. It killed the remaining crops and suffocated livestock caught in the open. Faced with ruin, thousands of families made the heartbreaking decision to leave. They packed their entire lives, their memories, their hopes, their few remaining possessions, into rickety cars and trucks. They headed west, chasing a rumor of jobs and a better life in California, the so-called Promised Land. But when they arrived, exhausted and destitute, they found no welcome. Instead, they found more hunger, more poverty, and a wall of prejudice. They were branded with the derogatory term Okies, a label that dismissed their history and their humanity. They became a symbol of despair, but also of incredible stubborn resilience. Back in the cities, a new kind of architecture emerged from the ruins of the economy. Makeshift shantytowns built from scraps of metal, wood, and cardboard sprang up on the edges of towns and in public parks. They were bitterly nicknamed Hoovervilles, a direct jab at President Herbert Hoover, whom many blamed for the crisis. Inside these Hoovervilles, men gathered around crackling fires, sharing stories of what they'd lost. Their farms, their jobs, their homes. The American restaurant was replaced by the soup kitchen, where a ladle of thin soup and a piece of bread were the only meal of the day for millions. Yet, even in the depths of this misery, sparks of resistance began to flicker. In the countryside, farmers organized, protesting the rock-bottom prices that were destroying their livelihoods. In the capital, thousands of World War I veterans marched on Washington, demanding the early payment of a bonus they had been promised. Their protest, the Bonus Army, was met not with compassion, but with tear gas and bayonets, ordered to disperse them from the city. The American dream, once a shining beacon of promise for anyone willing to work hard, had turned into a waking nightmare. The system felt broken. The future felt gone. It was into this broken nation that Franklin Delano Roosevelt took office in March of 1933. The country he inherited was on its knees. Banks were failing by the hundreds every week, wiping out the life savings of ordinary people. Faith in government, in capitalism, in the future itself, had all but evaporated. In his very first speech as president, broadcast to millions over the radio, Roosevelt delivered the words that would begin to reignite a nation's spirit. He said, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." It wasn't just a speech, it was a call to action. Within days, he declared a national bank holiday, shutting every single bank in the country. It was a radical, terrifying move, but it was necessary. Behind the closed doors, his administration worked tirelessly to audit and reorganize the financial system. Then, he began to reopen them, one by one, under new laws and federal insurance that restored trust. For the first time in years, people started putting money back into banks instead of pulling it out. This was just the beginning. He launched the New Deal, a sweeping series of ambitious programs designed to fight the Depression on all fronts. The goal was simple: get people working again. The Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC, put hundreds of thousands of young men to work in the countryside. They planted billions of trees, helping to heal the scarred land of the Dust Bowl. They restored national parks and fought soil erosion. They were given food, shelter, and a salary, most of which they sent home to their families. The Works Progress Administration, the WPA, was even larger. It gave jobs to millions, building the infrastructure of modern America. They constructed roads, bridges, dams, schools, libraries, and airports. The WPA didn't just employ laborers, it hired artists to paint murals, writers to document American life, and actors to put on plays for communities who had never seen one. This wasn't just about economic repair, it was about psychological healing. It was about restoring a sense of purpose and dignity. For the first time in a long, dark decade, people began to believe again. They saw new buildings going up. They saw their neighbors going back to work. They heard a president who spoke to them directly, who seemed to understand their struggle. It wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't fast. The road to recovery would be long and filled with challenges. But the New Deal provided something the country had lost completely: hope. The Great Depression was no longer just a story of loss. It was becoming a story of endurance, a testament to the resilience of a nation that refused to be broken. The Great Depression didn't just end. It reshaped everything we know. By the late 1930s, Roosevelt's New Deal had managed to rebuild a lot of America's faith, but it hadn't fully restored its fortune. Unemployment was still stubbornly high, hovering around 15%. It felt like the nation was stuck in a long, painful limbo. Then, something completely unexpected forced the final dramatic transformation: the outbreak of World War II. When war erupted in Europe in 1939, it was like a switch was flipped. America's factories, which had been silent for so long, suddenly roared back to life. Demand for war materials from Allied nations kick-started the economy. By 1941, when the U.S. officially joined the fight after the attack on Pearl Harbor, production didn't just increase, it exploded. Millions of men went off to war. In their place, millions of women streamed into factories, taking on jobs that had once been considered men's work. They became welders, riveters, and mechanics, building the machines of war. The iconic image of Rosie the Riveter wasn't just propaganda. It was a reality for countless American families. This massive mobilization had an incredible side effect. Unemployment, the Great Plague of the 1930s, vanished almost overnight. The same economy that had been drowning in despair now surged with unstoppable energy: steel, oil, planes, tanks. America became the arsenal of democracy, supplying not only its own forces but its allies around the globe. The sheer scale of production was staggering. The country was churning out a new ship almost every day, and a new plane every few minutes. This industrial might was a key factor in the Allied victory. When the war finally ended in 1945, the United States stood alone, unchallenged as the world's dominant economic and military superpower. The other major industrial nations were in ruins, but America emerged stronger than ever before. The war had not only ended the Depression, it had launched a new era of American prosperity that would last for decades. But beneath the triumph and the newfound wealth, deep scars remained. The Great Depression had fundamentally changed how people thought about money, government, and the very idea of survival. It wasn't just an economic event, it was a psychological one that left an indelible mark on an entire generation. This shift in thinking led to some of the most important government programs we have today. The memory of bank failures gave birth to the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC, which insures our bank deposits. The widespread poverty and desperation of the elderly led to the creation of Social Security, a safety net for retirees and the disabled. New labor protections were put in place, giving unions more power and establishing standards for wages and working hours. The very role of government was redefined. Before the Depression, most Americans expected the government to stay out of the economy. Afterward, there was a new expectation that the government should act as a guardian of stability, a force to prevent such a catastrophe from ever happening again. This was a monumental shift in the American social contract. The Depression also changed people on a personal level. The generation that had known hunger and breadlines learned never to waste a thing. They grew victory gardens, mended old clothes, and saved every penny they could. They passed these values of thrift and hard work down to their children, creating a culture of frugality that persisted for years. You might have heard stories from your grandparents about saving string or reusing tin foil. That's a direct legacy of the Depression. The era's culture reflected this deep societal trauma. Writers like John Steinbeck, in his novel The Grapes of Wrath, captured the pain and resilience of families forced from their homes. Photographers like Dorothea Lange, with her haunting images of migrant workers, immortalized the faces of the Depression. Tired, weathered, but filled with an unbreakable human spirit. Her photo, Migrant Mother, became one of the most famous photographs in history, a symbol of suffering and dignity. And though the Great Depression officially ended with the war, its lessons never truly did. The ghost of that era still haunts us. Every major financial crisis since, from the dot-com bubble to the 2008 financial meltdown and the economic shocks of 2020, echoes the same warnings. Look at the patterns: excessive debt, risky speculation, and growing inequality between the rich and the poor. History doesn't repeat itself exactly, as Mark Twain is said to have noted, but it often rhymes. The same human behaviors, greed, fear, and overconfidence, drive the booms and busts of our economy. The story beneath it all is always the same human story. The Great Depression wasn't just an event in a history book. It was a mirror held up to society. It revealed what happens when greed outpaces wisdom, when confidence turns into arrogance, and when a nation forgets that true prosperity must be built on a solid foundation, not just assumed. It remains to this day the most profound and terrifying reminder of just how fragile our modern civilization truly is. This was the Great Depression, not just a collapse of money, but a collapse of illusion. This is Blood and Fortune, where we explore how the past bleeds into the present. If you believe in the power of understanding history to shape a better future, show some love. Like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for watching.